Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. Joining us today is Dr. Al Kertz, and we're going to be digging into the topic of open or nipple bucket feeding. What's better for the dairy calf? Welcome, Al. Thanks for being here. Before we get
Good to be back.
Yeah, it's good to see you. Before we get started, I want to remind anyone if they have any questions to post them there in the chat, or if you're joining us from social media, you can post those right there in your social channel. So, Dr. Kertz, why don't you go ahead and give us the scoop on this?
Well, it's a topic that's been debated, and there's all kinds of opinions about it, but there hasn't been much study done. And so we're going to go into one particular trial or study that was published. But before we get there, there's a couple comparisons. One is a nipple bottle compared to an open bucket, or a nipple bottle compared to a nipple bucket. So that would be two variables at the same time. So in this case, they kept it simple. It was comparing a bucket, open bucket, with another bucket that had a nipple. So you had bucket to bucket kind of comparison. And if we look at how calves are fed, the last NOM study was in 2014. And then there was some update in 2016, and found that about 70-some% of operations use buckets. And then another study with the heifer calves found that about 60% of the heifers were fed with buckets. In this case, we were looking at Brazil, where the numbers are about 70% of operations that use buckets. And this study was done by the University of Sao Paulo at their Piracicaba location, which is north of Sao Paulo, because it's got to be in a more rural area where they have research farm. And I've been there. It's a good facility and a good group of people that do research there. So they looked at their own herd. They had two treatments, an open bucket. And the interesting thing is the diameter was only about 10 inches. So it wasn't that big a bucket, and it only held about 2.5 gallons. And then they had a nipple bucket, and that was a similar. And so there were 15 calves on each of those treatments. They fed 6 liters a day of whole milk, and that was divided into 2 feedings. And then they were gradually weaned from day 56 to 60 by dropping off about 1 liter a day. So that's a fairly short weaning period. They were individually housed in wood hutches, which had a chain from the calf's neck to the hutch. So they had a free range with the length of the chain, but the hutches were positioned so that they were not, calves weren't able to touch each other, nose-to-nose contact. And then they moved them every day on an open grass area that was clipped, so there wasn't that much grass available. Now, they also fed them water-free choice and a pelleted starter, which had about 26%, 25% protein, which is very high protein. But we'll come back to that as we see some of the results about the starter intake. So they, in addition, did some behavioral studies. They had direct observations on 4 hours right after the morning feeding. And that was done about 4 times during the period of 28 days. So those are the observation periods. And then they looked at how fast the calves drank the liquid, whether it was in a bucket or the nipple. And then they calibrated that information, or collected that information, and summarized it as well. So if we look at the first table then, we can see that the body weights were basically the same between the two treatments. The final body weight, though, was actually a couple pounds greater on those fed with the open bucket. And the daily gain, though, was about the same. The starter intake, however, was different. It was greater with the calves that are on the open bucket, 7/10 of a pound per day. It's not very high, and we'll come back to that in a minute. The milk intake, the speed of it was much different. The calves just drank down the open bucket very quickly, 1.86 minutes to drink the 3 liters. Whereas when they had the nipple in the bucket, it was over 5 minutes. So there was quite a difference there. But the total dry matter intake was similar, a little higher though with the open bucket because they ate more starter. Wither height was basically the same. Fecal score was a bit different, a little bit higher on the nipple bottle. And then the blood glucose was a bit higher there too. So if we look at some of the figures, we can see a little bit more about what happened during the week. So figure 1, you see the dark column, open bucket, and there's the plot is the speed. And you see that initially there wasn't as big a gap between the two in the week 2, but in week 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and all the way out to 8, the calves adjusted evidently, and they just drank the open bucket down very quickly. So it had a much greater difference in speed. Now, if we look at the next figure, figure 2, we look at the starter intake. And that really differentiated about week 4, as you see there. And that's when the open bucket calves ate more starter from there on out. Now, what's interesting is it didn't show up that much in the daily gain difference, even though they drank the same amount, had different speeds of drinking it. But it seems like what happened was, and this is what the authors speculated too, is that when the calves drank their milk faster in the open bucket and they were still hungry, they ate more starter. That is after the 4th week. Not before that, there wasn't that much of it. And remember, this is a pelleted starter. So we have a couple factors here. One is they didn't drink much. They didn't eat much starter in the first 4 weeks, as you see in this graph. Not difference between the two. And then it's spread out. Now, it's still the amount of starter being consumed wasn't that great. But then that would be expected because remember, this is a pelleted starter. They had no forage. They were under this grass field, but it was clipped, and evidently, if there was any intake, it didn't materialize much. So when calves are fed only a pelleted starter, it creates marginal acidosis, and that results in lower intake of the starter because they don't have the same appetite when they have marginal acidosis. Now let's look at the table 2. If you see the first column, look at the first column, open bucket, they're eating the starter. It was 3.7. These are minutes versus the nipple bottle, 1.9. So a considerable difference there. Consuming milk, and remember these are observations. So you see that they spent less time consuming milk with the open bucket because they drank it faster. And now look at the rumination. There is some greater rumination with the open bucket versus nipple bucket calves, and that's most likely because they were eating more starter. But now, if you consider the amount of time they spent ruminating, it's a very low percentage. I think I calculated there that um, the percentage of time they were eating it was like 0.7% of the observed time were they ruminating. And that makes sense because on a pelleted starter, it doesn't have any significant particle size. So the calves don't spend much time ruminating. There's nothing to ruminate. And that's quite low because in this one study that was done when I was a graduate student at Cornell with John Porter, um, calves that were fed a pelleted starter only ruminated about 8.7% of the time, which is much more than the 0.7% here. But when they were fed the texturized starter, they ruminated about 21% of the time. And that's more normal for cows that have typical rumination. So, one of the issues with this study was that the pelleted starter probably had some impact on limiting what the calves were able to gain because they gained about 1.3 pounds. And we'd like to see that be about 1.5 pounds because then that would double their birth weight at the end of 2 months. And that's what the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association recommends for calves in the first 2 months. And these calves didn't quite get there, and I think it's all because of the pelleted starter not being able to be consumed that much because it created marginal acidosis. Now, if we look at the last figure, 5, and these figures were given to me after I requested from Dr. Carla Bitar. And actually, I asked her a question, and she created figure 2. So she went a little beyond just a simple request. But if we look at the figure 3, on the left-hand side, we have rumination, minutes per 4-hour observation. So you see in the first 4 weeks, there was none. And remember, the starter intake was relatively low, and there was no difference between the two treatments. But now in week 5, when the open bucket fed calves began to eat more starter, you see how they spent more time ruminating in 5 and 6. Well, 5, and then 6 and 7, 7 and 8, they came pretty close together. But it's strictly because they're starting to eat more starter, and even though it's pelleted, they are ruminating some. But remember, the amount of rumination time was very low, 0.7% of the time. So in this case, there were some differences between the open bucket and the nipple pail, but there was also some real difference because they were feeding the pelleted starter.
So how do you sort through that, Al? What's the bottom line? What does all that mean?
I think there's 2 factors. One is that they were studying the open bucket versus the nipple. And there's no doubt that they drank the open bucket faster. And because of that, they ate a bit more starter. But remember, the starter, I was limiting them because it's all pelleted. Now, another factor is that I've seen happen when I was with a Purina consultant one time on a dairy farm. The nipples come with a certain opening size. But in this particular case, they were feeding colostrum to these newborn calves, and they were kind of struggling with drinking it. And they couldn't figure out why. And the consultant said, well, bring me one of the bottles with the nipple. He did. Well, they'd cut the nipple crossways so it had a bigger opening. And so the calves were drinking so fast, it was coming, some of it was going down their lungs, and they were coughing. So if you can use a nipple bucket, don't cheat and
Don't
make
cheat.
them think faster because that's part of what they should be doing. So, you can kind of, as we say, pick your poison. You can do it with an open bucket. You can do it with a nipple, but remember the speed of drinking is going to be slower. And if that's what you want, then you go with the nipple.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you for that insight and for that review of that research. That's very interesting, Al. And of course, we'll have Dr. Kertz back with us next month for another update on some relevant research. And you can read his column on feedstuffs.com and in our digital issues every month. So, Dr. Kertz, as always, thank you for being with us.
You're welcome. Glad to be with you.
And we appreciate all of you tuning in as well. For Feedstuffs, I'm Sarah Muirhead.